Greetings, you curious, you courageous Herle Burly-ites. A special show today because it's a guest I've wanted to have on the pod for quite a while. We're talking with Brian Tobin, who in my mind has a place on the first-line all-star politician team. Probably plays center, but now that he's in business, we're likely to find him on the right side of the ice from time to time as well. I'll précis his bio because it's long and accomplished. Born in Stephenville, Newfoundland, first elected to Parliament in 1980, re-elected to his Liberal seat during the Mulroney wipeout of 1984, which was no small feat, becomes, in the great tradition of Newfoundland orators, a very well-spoken and persuasive Minister of Fisheries and Oceans when the Liberals regained power after almost a decade in opposition. He leads and implements the Oceans Act, plays a critical federal spokesperson role in the 1995 Quebec Referendum, helping to organize the great rally in Montreal on the eve of the referendum. Resigns in 1996 to become leader of the Liberal Party of Newfoundland and wins a large majority there, replacing Clyde Wells, returns to federal politics, interestingly, in 2000 and becomes Minister of Industry. Departs politics rather abruptly 2 years later, and we may get to that on this pod, and embarks on a long and successful business career, and finally named as an officer of the Order of Canada in 2013. So we're going to talk about all that today. We'll look back on the career of this amazing politician, talk about his transition from politics to business, as well as his thoughts on today's political scene and the current economic climate. Brian, we haven't talked to each other for so long. I'm having memories rushing back over me right now.
Well, you and I shared a bunch of history of very interesting times in the political life of Canada. And of course, it remains very interesting, and it's a pleasure to catch up with you. You become famous as a man who occupies the airways of Canada and churns out a hell of a great podcast. Congrats.
I was Brian. It turns out a failure at actually doing politics, but reasonably successful at talking about it. So,
yeah, well, hey. I don't believe it, but anyway, it's very modest of you to suggest that.
Hey, do you miss it? Politics?
You know, I can honestly tell you that I don't miss it. I think, which is not to say I didn't absolutely, thoroughly, completely, and utterly enjoy it when I was there. And if I were to say otherwise, I'd be, lying to my teeth. It is an incredible privilege to be able to participate in the public life of your country or your province, or your community for that matter. And for those of us who've had that privilege, we can only say thank you for the people who gave us an opportunity to do so. When I was in politics, I couldn't even imagine not being in political life. And I remember when I did finally retire from political life after 22 years of being elected, and 2 years before that as an executive assistant, so 24 years straight, Rex Murphy, my old friend, fellow Newfoundlander, wrote a piece, which is, I think the beginning of the piece was, "It's as if fish refuse to swim," when Brian refuses to be in politics. And I felt that way, but I was committed after 24 years straight of political life and, 7 elections and a couple of referendums to doing something different. I had always had a desire. I don't know where it comes from. My maternal grandfather was a business guy and ran a small business successfully, a trucking company, et cetera. I don't know, maybe it's in the genes, but I always had a desire to want to participate in the business life of Canada as well. And I knew at 47 that I had time for another career, a legitimate full career. I've been elected. I got in politics at 23. I've been elected at 25. I really knew nothing but political life. And I really poured my, as much heart and soul into a second life, a business life, as I put into my first life, and have enjoyed the experience of being part of the business community of Canada.
Cool. Can we look back a little bit? One of the things I think about these days, Brian, and you have such a unique perspective on the time, on the 90s. Because you were a federal minister and you were a premier, and then after that you went into business. So you had to deal with the austerity of that time from all those different perspectives. You had to deal with the public policy of that time from all those different perspectives. In retrospect, how do you feel about the policy agenda of the Chrétien government?
I think that if anybody is looking for an example of how it is possible, on the one hand, to be progressive in one's policy focus and orientation, and I think of the beginnings, much more has been done since of rational policy with respect to how we interact and reconcile with First Nations. I think of investments in technology, investments in centers of excellence, in a return to competitiveness. I think of rational fiscal and monetary policy, Jean as Prime Minister and Paul as Minister of Finance, and the exercise we went through to effectively eliminate a $42 million deficit. Pragmatic, practical approach to politics, things that worked. I think those were, frankly, golden years. I mean, think about what happened, and from the vantage point of today, it's quite remarkable. We collectively had a large deficit. Our debt to GDP ratio was pushing 70+%. We were, quote unquote, on our way to hitting the wall. And we went from that to budget surpluses. We actually paid down debt. We had 10 years of balanced budgets. We were the only country in the OECD to be running balanced budgets year after year and paying down debt. The only one. I think there were a lot of lessons that one can draw upon the pragmatic, middle of the road nature of that administration, pragmatic nature of that administration in those years. Didn't get everything perfect. Nobody would suggest we did, but it was an incredible partnership for a lot of years. I mean, we can talk about a little later on. Things got difficult in the party at some point, as happens in every administration at some point. But we had a very productive team for a long time, and we think about the book on Lincoln, team of rivals. Jean Chrétien was very good at building a team of rivals. He took his rivals in the leadership and put them in key slots in his government, none more key than this finance portfolio, and inviting Paul to take on that responsibility, Paul Martin. So it worked. It was challenging, but it worked, and it was. I think you got to go back a long time in Canadian history to find a more successful run. And in Jean Chrétien's case, there were a lot of other extenuating circumstances, but 3 elections in a row, pretty good run.
I agree with all that. I don't have any quarrel with that summary at all. What I think about sometimes, Brian, is whether that agenda just went a little bit too far. Whether, you probably had some thoughts about it when you were a minister and had your budget cut probably 50%. And then when you went back to be Premier of Newfoundland, where you were probably counting how many squares of toilet paper everybody used in the government. And then now, people talk about this housing crisis and they go, well, where's the federal government in housing? So it does cause me to reflect a little bit.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is a fair comment, but I think from where we were, the fiscal room we had, and I'm just going to ask you to remember it. I know you remember it well. You were there. You were in the middle of it, in Paul's office and organization. Our debt to GDP level was so high. One of the highest, and I think it was the highest in the G7. Yeah. That we really needed to put the brakes on. We needed to get back to a place that was sustainable, and the fundamental issue that if you don't do the right but difficult things now, then the things that really matter, the Canada Pension Plan, the old age security, our commitment to healthcare, our commitment to invest in post-secondary education, et cetera, transfers to the provinces, all of that would ultimately be at risk as our capacity as a country to go out to the world and say, buy our bonds, would be at risk, or at least the cost of putting those bonds out and what we'd have to pay to have people hold them would become far more expensive. So it wasn't as if we were in a healthy position and we were cutting deeper than needed to be against the backdrop of a rather healthy fiscal and monetary situation. We were approaching crisis levels, and I think we deserve collectively, all of us. And by the way, I was one of a handful, as you know, of ministers who've sat on that committee that did the cutting, called in all of our colleagues and forced them to, because every colleague said, fully agree with the agenda. We need to make cuts, but not in my department. And let me tell you why. And, so we had Jean was smart. He formed a committee of colleagues to say to our peers in cabinet, well, I'm sorry, you've got to participate alongside everybody else. So was it too deep? Arguably, did we take too much out of the backs of the provinces, transfers to provinces in order to solve a federal problem? One could argue that. But at the same time, we did a pretty thorough job of skinnying down the federal government and all of its programs. I mean, let's just remind listeners, because it's easy to forget, that we went line by line through every department and every program in every department, and we asked the fundamental question, is this program, which was invented 5 years ago, 15 years ago, 35 years ago, relevant today as it was when it was invented, or is it on autopilot? Right. And if it was on autopilot, we brought that plane down and we ceased having that expenditure. I believe government of Canada could do the same exercise again, and it would be, it looks to me like the new president of the Treasury Board, Anita Hernandez, is on her way to doing that.
All right, I'll tell Paul you agree with him. It'll make him happy.
Yeah, that's right. I did agree with it. I did agree with it. Absolutely. No, and I have the scars as a member of that group of ministers to demonstrate that I agree with them. And by the way, let me just say something else. When I became the Premier of Newfoundland in 1996, you made a comment about Newfoundland. It's interesting. I took the lessons of the federal government back to the province of Newfoundland, and we attacked the structural deficit back there. And we actually had, and the Minister of Finance of the day was a guy named Paul Dix, good friend of Paul Martin's, good friend of mine. We actually eliminated Newfoundland and Labrador's deficit. We ran a small deficit because we thought it would be too dangerous to have a surplus. Auditor General called us out on it. We actually were paying down debt in Newfoundland and Labrador, and that was a direct reflection of the reality that if we're able to do it federally, where there was stressed capacity to borrow, certainly in the case of Newfoundland, where there is no capacity to borrow, we were really in a difficult place. We did the same exercise there, and we improved by a substantial margin the fiscal and monetary capacity of the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. Made a few deals with Paul Martin along the way that helped us get to a budget balance.
Right. You were talking just a few minutes ago very, very warmly about Mr. Kretschmann. And you were very close to him in that period of time.
Still am. I should tell you, I called him recently on the day of his 89th birthday, and I said, Jean, happy birthday. He said, thank you very much. Very typical Jean response. No particular, celebration of the moment. I said, where are you? He said, I'm in the office. I said, what in the hell are you doing in the office? It's your birthday today. You're 89. He said, I know, but I'm saving for my retirement.
That's excellent. Tell me what really impressed you working with him and what you learned from him.
I think there were a number of things that one could refer to, but a couple that really stand out in my mind, and you will remember this. One of the things that was really fascinating about walking into his office was, first of all, you knew that if you're going to have any impact, you better walk in with as little paper as possible. So here's a guy with a multi-decade career across almost every ministry in the government of Canada, who basically was well-versed on most issues going back a very long time. So if you're going to see him, you're really going to tell him what the latest chapter is on whatever file it is you might be bringing to the table. Yeah. So he was an incredibly quick study. His desk was, you'll recall this, clear. At the end of the day, his people must have taken every piece of paper off his desk, put it away, because he would say, I'm done. So he was a great decider. And Jean Chrétien understood the importance of not being a bottleneck in his own government. That to the extent that anything rose to him, it was his job to make a decision. Good, bad, or ugly, let's make the decision. Let's make the call. Let's make things move. I thought that was a really important leadership skill, the ability to make the call and to move on with the agenda. The other thing I really was impressed with Jean Chrétien is he delegated very substantial authority to his ministers. So he literally would say, you've got the ball, you run with it. If you do well, we'll all be happy. He would say with a twinkle in his eye, I'll take the credit. And if you don't do well, I'll get a new minister. But he didn't, in my opinion, try and run the government from his office or from the PMO. You may have had people in PMO who might wanted to have run the government from PMO, but not Chrétien. Chrétien, I actually said to him the very first time I walked into his office as a minister, and I frequently tell the story to business colleagues in the context of roles and responsibilities and accountability. I said to him, how much power do I have? He kind of paused. I think he was surprised by the question. And he grinned and said, as much as you take. And I said, good. You may come to regret those words, Prime Minister. He said, yeah, you do what you think is right. You know what your role and responsibility is. You make the call. And if it goes well, great. And if it doesn't go well, I get a new minister. I like that style of leadership. I think trying to run any organization, be it a bank, be it a government, be it a private sector organization, where the center or the CEO tries to run everything, is the CEO's job, the leader's job, is to lead and manage the talent and the team and to manage the direction of the ship. It's not to try and pull the sails up and down or even to have a hand on the rudder all day long. You need a team to do that and to do it effectively.
So we've been talking here about a specific kind of investment that improves how we live in this country. And no, I don't mean my lifelong emotional investment in a certain green Canadian football team, although my attachment to the Riders is absolutely critical to how I live. I'm talking about the $240 billion and counting our presenting sponsor TELUS has invested to connect the whole of this country, urban centers and rural communities alike, building out their wireless and pure fiber network infrastructure, continually innovating and expanding services. But last week, I raised the very real specter of today's uncertain regulatory environment and how it threatens to curtail that investing. Remember those mandated regimes I was talking about? Briefly, the CRTC is considering a policy that gives wholesalers access to an established carrier's wireline network and what that could do to rural Canada, especially if they set an artificially low mandated rate to drive price competition at the cost of everything else. Here's a very real example of what it might cost, Herle Burly-ites. It's a big, craggy, far-flung, waterlogged country, eh? Somebody's got to connect it, and somebody's got to pay for it. Before the pandemic, the cost to build in our rural communities was 2.5 times more than in urban areas. Now, because of inflation and rising interest rates, that number has ballooned to between 4 and 10 times what it was previous. I mean, think about the vast distances between places, our low population density, the unforgiving climate, and all those pesky mountains, oceans, and lakes that get in the way. Not to be crass about it, but carriers like TELUS have to be able to recoup the massive investments it takes to build across all of Canada, not just our biggest cities. But policies like mandated regimes and the unpredictable cost pressures that come with it make the business case for continued investment in rural communities precarious. And I'm using precarious here as a euphemism for damn near impossible. Who ultimately pays the price? Canadians who live in our smaller places do. More next week. You know, when I look back on that time, I think you had a very large public profile, but so did others. Martin, Axworthy, Rock, later on Dion. These were all well-known figures in Canadian politics with prominent and distinct images. Nobody has that. No ministers have that profile anymore. Why do you think that is? And is that bad or good?
I like that style. And again, I can't comment on. I don't know, David, and you'd have better insights than I would. Whether there's been a change in how the media covers politics, whether more of it is pushed into the social media portals than in the mainstream television, newspapers, et cetera, that were prominent during the 80s and 90s. But you're right. I mean, if you go back to the Pierre Elliott Trudeau days or the Brian Mulroney days or the Jean Chrétien days, et cetera, there were always through all that period of time, going back to the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, certainly a good number of prominent participants in the political life of the country. By the way, on both sides of the aisle, not just the government side, but the opposition side as well. You'd have a leader of the opposition, but you'd have several prominent members of the opposition as well. We seem to have evolved so that we pay less attention to members of the team on both sides of the aisle, both opposition and government, than used to be the case. And I think that's because we really are trying to program too much the team. So here are the talking points, be it opposition or be it government. Everybody speak to the talking points.
Everybody sounds the same, right?
They all sound the same. And the notion that people will have views and personalities and come at matters a little differently from their colleagues, there doesn't seem to be room for that anymore. Look, we know, we have to be honest, of course, whether it was a Martin government or a Chrétien government or a Mulroney government or a Harper government, everybody tries to program to some extent to make sure that we don't have people going off too far afield. But it seems to me that we've lost the capacity to indulge strong personalities with strong views who reflect different regions of Canada. It's healthy to have all the regions reflected in the House of Commons. That's why it was there in the first place. Okay. To the extent that we don't have that, that's a loss for Canada.
Yeah. So, can we talk about 2002?
Sure.
All right. This is a conversation you and I have never had before. So, things started to fall apart between Martin and Chrétien around 2000. And between the convention and the election. And you came back, you left the premiership to come back to federal politics. And I mean, I had the clear impression that you had come back at the request of Mr. Chrétien to be his champion to defeat Martin, to be the person that could stop Martin in a leadership race. And I certainly thought you were the person most likely to do that, if that could be done. I certainly thought that you were the most likely person to do that. I was a lot more afraid of you than I was of, say, Manley. And then you, as you know, almost every review of your, almost every bio says, suddenly quit in 2002 on the eve of what would have been the leadership. Personal and family reasons, I hear you. But why'd you do that?
I think that first of all, it is true, and it would be silly to say otherwise, that I was clearly thinking down the road to the day when Jean Chrétien would decide to do other things about what succession would look like, and had given some thought to that process, as is normal in the political process. One of the things that became very clear to me over a period of time is that Paul Martin and his team, you were part of that team, had done a very good job of learning lessons from the previous leadership and organizing early, right across the country, in all the jurisdictions that together make up the federal Liberal Party across all of the provinces of the country. And in particular, thinking about the membership of the party and the membership process, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So as my assessment after some period of time was that Paul pretty well had a lock on this. It was a matter of mechanics, it was a matter of tactics, it was a matter of strategy, and it was a matter of a lot of work, obviously, in being done by people on his behalf who were interested in his leadership for a number of years. And I think that I was pragmatic enough to see that and to understand that. So contrary to what you might think, I was coming quickly to the conclusion this is done, and I think there's nothing more important than being clear-eyed and sober and serious in assessment of those kind of situations. That was my assessment. The reason I actually left that was a secondary factor. What really caused me to leave politics was a disagreement, which ultimately was with PMO, and that was on the issue of funding for broadband in Canada, and it was something that I have to tell you, I think we missed a great opportunity on.
Yeah, it was a good idea. It was a mistake on the part of the government.
It was a bad call, and we had David Johnson at the time, subsequently being Governor General. We had a task force set up. We had a lot of work done. We had all of the cable companies. Everybody was committed to beginning the process of putting broadband in rural and northern Canada. And I come from Newfoundland and Labrador, and I took the view that
that would have made you a hero. That can't happen, right?
I'm glad you're acknowledging that. And for some reason, the Minister of Finance didn't think it was a good idea. Paul didn't think that was a priority. But I believe, David, now, and I believe then, and we're beginning to do something with it. Elon Musk has come with, LEO satellites to help us get there. But the notion that in a contemporary sense, and now I go back 20 years in saying this, that you're going to have people participate in a technologically enabled economy without access to Wi-Fi, and I mean high-speed Wi-Fi, high-speed broadband. It's game over if you're not plugged in. So I took that view. I thought I was very strongly committed to that view. I thought that I had a commitment from the Prime Minister, from Jean Chrétien, to see that done. And for whatever reason, it wasn't in the budget. And I took the view, well, I've just been blindsided. I'm only going to be blindsided once. It won't happen again. And I decided 22 years, 24 years, time to retire. So to the extent that Mr. Martin decided that wasn't a good budget item, probably got rid of a very troubling individual, to the extent that individual might have been tempted to get into a leadership race. But the truth of the matter is, it was very clear to me that the Paul and his team had done their homework.
Hey, Herle Burly-ites, that's why you listen to this show. It's insight like that. Okay, now, the next question then is why you didn't run in 2006 for the leadership of the party. The three top-ranking people were an American, a New Democrat, and an unpopular person. You would have been a titan in that field. Why didn't you run?
No, I have to say, when I left political life, I had a great run. Had won every election I'd ever been in and every referendum I'd ever been part of, right. Except the Charlottetown Accord, because that didn't carry everywhere. It carried down our neck of the woods, but not everywhere. I had already made the transition to a private life and to a business life. And as you may or may not have noticed, I don't have a social media account. I don't have a Twitter account. I don't post daily. This is an exception. I actually don't do CBC or CTV or do political commentary. And I really, really had made a transition to a private life and to a business life. And I really had no desire to go back. I mean, I think there's a time when we spill our best energy in political life, but we should start by understanding that it's temporary duty. It's a privilege, but one day it'll be over, and that we shouldn't be shy about stepping aside and recognizing that others will step in. And for me, I really said to myself, I don't want to be the guy that hangs around, the talking head that pops up all over the place all the time, still talking about political life. Am I interested? Absolutely. Do I follow closely what's happening? Not terribly closely. Yes, I do. Both in Canada and around the world. I'm obsessed by what's happening in the United States, for example. But does the world need me back in politics? Not at all. Although we need, energetic, dynamic people who are able to think outside the box again, and I would say this: we need people who skate again closer to the middle of the road, liberals, middle of the road politicians of whatever stripe, trying to find pragmatic solutions rather than finding themselves on one extreme or the other of any question.
Yeah.
That doesn't provide solutions. It provides a lot of noise, but leaves us without much progress.
So, any meeting held in the offices of our sponsor, CN, starts with a contemplation of safety. That is to say, each and every meeting, period. Safety is a grail at CN, as you'd expect from a company whose business involves deploying some of the most powerful machines on Earth to move millions of tons of cargo over hundreds of thousands of miles every year. CN is responsible not just for keeping its 25,000 plus railroaders safe, but also the cities, towns, and villages along its North American network. So the railway spends a great deal of money on safety equipment and technology. Its railroaders are encouraged to talk about safety and think safety and live by something called life-critical rules. They learn to think about everything they do, and that impulse can be deadly. That luck, while wonderful, is no substitute for vigilance. CN employees who come up with innovative safety ideas are honored and rewarded, like the track inspectors in Manitoba, who began carrying cans of spray dye, using it to expose track defects that might otherwise cause serious accidents. Later on this month, CN will participate in Railway Safety Week, a series of events meant to raise safety awareness and encourage the participation of the communities along its network. The fact is, though, every week is Railway Safety Week at CN, and always will be. Oh, one other thing. If CN has a single overriding message to communicate to Canadians on rail safety, it is this: stay off railway tracks and obey signaling. For heaven's sake, never try to race a locomotive. They always move faster than they appear to be moving, they take a long time to stop, and just about any road vehicle stands about as much chance in a collision as a soda can. Be safe, people. So you talked about your transition into business, and you've had such a successful and relatively seamless transition from politics to business. I mean, there was that little kerfuffle with Frank Stronach, but without knowing any facts, I just assume you're on the right side of that. And but you've been a big success in business, and most politicians find that transition difficult. Most politicians find the business community is not that interested in them, that their skills aren't that valued in Canada. The United States is very different, but in Canada, it can be a very rough thing for ex-politicians. What worked for you?
I think to start with, I think you've got to understand that there are no sinecures. There are no sort of safe and comfortable little spots to go and spend a period of time. You've got to be ready to roll up your sleeves and to add value. And by add value, I mean hard work. I decided right off the top that I didn't want to be in the business of representing businesses to governments, whether it's the federal government or to provincial governments or municipal governments. I really wanted to engage in the business community. So I joined a number of initiatives, boards, both mid-sized boards and smaller boards, companies that were growing, and got involved in raising capital, seed capital, and building businesses from the ground up. You may know I was the chair of a small mining company that was right on the Quebec-Labrador border, right in the middle of the Labrador.
I wish you'd cut me in on that goddamn thing, for Christ's sake. Why didn't you give me a call?
Anyway, we took that one from a penny stock to almost a $5 billion cash exit, very successful. And we had a couple of other things that I was involved in where we started small. We started with seed capital, and we were able to generate really good returns for our shareholders. So in the middle of all that, David, I spent 10 years with a company called Fraser Milner Casbrain, now part of Dentons, which is a law firm. So I was there for 10 years as a senior business advisor. Sat on a bunch of boards as a director, chaired most of them, all the way from Aecon, which is Canada's largest publicly traded construction company, to New Flyer Industries for 18 years, where I was the chairman of the board. We've just gone through the challenge of COVID, and supply chain issues, but that company is now well positioned to be the dominant player in electric buses in North America and in the UK. To Element Fleet, biggest leasing company in North America. I was chairman of the board there, and on and on. And today I'm at the Bank of Montreal, have been for almost 11 years now, as both the vice chair of BMO Financial Group, and I'm the chair of BMO Nesbitt Burns, and I also sit as supervisor of the board that we have in China, fully licensed board in China as well for our operations there. So I'm a busy guy. I'm very fortunate, very lucky to have had an opportunity to participate in Canada's business community. And the business community, like the political community, are full of really fascinating characters. People who are they're just game changers. They're visionaries. They're risk takers. Not risk takers in the irresponsible sense, but risk takers in the sense of willing to skate outside their lanes and find new ways and creative ways, innovative ways of doing things. So it's, to me, to have a life of 22 years of politics, elected politics, and now 22 years in the business community, I'm a blessed guy. It's, life's been really fascinating, really interesting.
Hmm. What skills did you bring from politics that you found useful in business?
I think you will know this. I say this to my friends in the business community who probably are surprised when I say it. For senior politicians, senior ministers, prime ministers, premiers, etc., who are doing their jobs, who are well informed and who are effective, these are incredibly hardworking people. They are engaged 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, to the detriment of their family life, no doubt. But the capacity to multitask, the capacity to take complex issues and to reduce it to its essential 4, 5, 6 major points. The capacity, because there's so much material coming at you in political life, depending on the department you're in and the job you have, to the capacity to, as we talked about earlier, to make decisions, to move the agenda forward, not to get bogged down in indecision or not to have a bottleneck at the top. The capacity to read a room, to understand that in any negotiation, it can't be a one-sided win. The best deals are the deals when everybody feels they've had a good result, a good outcome. So just, I regard myself as somebody who really enjoys the art of negotiation, getting to the deal, getting the deal closed, and doing it in a way, as I say, where everybody feels they've had a win in that transaction. So those are some of the attributes I would say are important, and they can be transferable from public life to a private life, and of course, the capacity to communicate what's important to you. So everybody understands the game plan. Everybody understands the track we're on. Everybody understands what the next 10 steps are and what the outcome is we're looking for. That's important as well. If you don't understand or you can't articulate what it is we're trying to accomplish, you're not likely to get there.
Right. Cool. My sense, Brian, is that the gulf between political decision makers in Canada and the business community has never been wider. I don't get the sense right now that either side of that really understands the other or is communicating very well with the other. Am I right about that, or is there more synchronicity than I think that there is?
Regrettably, I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying. There is a fair amount of engagement here, there, and everywhere between business leaders and public policy makers. But it is probably true that capital generally, and business leaders in particular, and those who are the entrepreneurial types I talked about, the people who create opportunity, are less, on the one hand, less inclined to think about Canada as a destination because they feel there's less acknowledgement or appreciation for the kind of risk-taking they want to do with their capital to try and build new businesses than is available in other jurisdictions. On the other hand, Canada is still a phenomenal jurisdiction. I mean, it's easy to talk about the shortcomings, easy to talk about the challenges, but the reality is, what is the most important component of any successful business is not just the leader and the idea and the capital, it's people. Trained, educated, talented, can deliver workforce. A leadership team, of course, but all of the people who make up that team. And, Canada is a richly endowed jurisdiction in the world. In order to do that, we're parked right next door to the most important economic jurisdiction in the world, the United States. We've got great access to that marketplace. I don't want to say that we're chasing capital out of the country. I will say we're not sending a signal at a very competitive time globally that we understand our capacity as a country to compete and to win against any jurisdiction anywhere, and that we're prepared to demonstrate that by the policy frameworks that we form. So if every time somebody says there's a problem with the budget in the city of Toronto, and the message comes out, we're just going to tax banks, we're going to tax people with insurance companies, we're going to tax people who live in certain neighborhoods, whatever. And we all know that's going to produce a number. From a public policy point of view, it doesn't produce anything that has an impact, but it's a political thing. Let's tax the rich. Right. Well, at a certain point, people pack a bag. And they don't say anything; they just quietly go away. So I think it's very important for us to, when you've got a 25, 30, 35-year-old entrepreneur doing great things, world beating, let's celebrate them. Let's celebrate Canada's success. They don't need a tax break. They don't need a hand up necessarily once they're launched and on their way. But they also don't need to feel like they're being beat up or attacked or that someone's got they're a target right. In a way that they wouldn't be somewhere else. Right. I think the country always does well when we find the generosity in our hearts to reach out to those who do less well on the one hand, and when we find the joy to celebrate those who demonstrate a capacity to lift us all up by their success.
Is there a policy in there somewhere? Like, what could the government do to send the right signal?
I'd be very careful as we move forward I was in China 10 days ago. I was in BYDs. BYD is a big battery maker, bus maker, car maker. BYD stands for Build Your Dreams. Okay. I was in one of their plants in Shenzhen. Plant had 70,000 people in that campus. 70,000 people of a multi 500,000 or 600,000 people company. Second biggest EV maker after Tesla, but growing faster than Tesla. That's just China, Korea, and on and on. Canada has a long history, successful history in the auto industry. I guess what I'm saying is there's lots of competition out there across a whole bunch of sectors of what's important for our economy, and we need to be able to compete and win. And part of doing that is continuing to offer a very attractive business environment, and that doesn't mean necessarily always providing the biggest subsidies. But it does mean providing an environment where people don't feel that by being here, they're going to be unreasonably penalized or taxed or treated in a way that says your capital is not important or you're not important or your family.
Yeah. Just on a sort of an aspect of that, I've been talking to a lot of people about productivity in the Canadian economy, and there's lots of different ideas about that. But one of the things that almost everybody seems to think explains the gap between U.S. productivity and Canadian productivity is less investment by Canadian business, less capital investment in technology and other productivity enhancing measures than happens in the United States and elsewhere. Do you have any idea why that would be the case?
Well, I think the American taxation system does provide some rather significant incentives for more capital investment, and in particular, the IRA, so-called Inflation Reduction Act, is a game changer. Mm-hmm. And Canada, to its credit, and the government of Canada, Mr. Trudeau's government, and the Minister of Finance have responded with some, in the last budget, with some initiatives of our own, $15 billion worth of funding targeted toward attracting innovative spending in Canada by Canada's business community. And I think when you look at the numbers going out a year or two from now, you'll see a turn. You'll see a business community doing some very targeted and very significant spending toward enhancing our productivity. But we shouldn't, again, kid ourselves that if you're next to a jurisdiction where many of the folks who operate in Canada also have plants in the United States, also have plants in Mexico, some cases plants elsewhere in Europe, or for that matter in Asia. And if the return on capital here is X, and the return on capital somewhere else is Y, and it's a publicly traded company, you have an obligation to shareholder David Herle to give him a good return on his investment, you're going to put that capital to work where it gets the greatest return. And so if there's a skewing of the opportunity to deploy capital between Canada and in particular the United States, then you're going to see a bigger capital spend in the United States because there's a greater expectation of return there. It's not a mystery. We cannot allow ourselves to be too out of kilter with what's happening south of the border. In the case of the United States, the last big initiative wasn't a Republican initiative. It's not a partisan thing. It was a Democratic Party initiative. It was Mr. Biden. We had to respond to the extent that our fiscal capacity allows us to respond. But we were after the fact. Right. We didn't take the first step. We were in a respond mode. So the simple answer is that we have to learn less to be responsive and more to be, making the first move, be a first mover. Now, all that said, huge advantage for business being in Canada, with the continuing fact that we still have a publicly funded healthcare system, and it is a considerable continued advantage for Canadian based manufacturers and businesses.
Do you think Ottawa, to go back to our earlier discussion, do you think Ottawa understands business well enough to actually do this now?
Well, I want to say yes. I mean, I've had conversations with ministers that really have impressed me with their commitment to understanding the need for Canada to be competitive. Minister Champagne clearly gets it. Minister Arnand clearly gets it. I had a great conversation a few days ago, last week in Montreal, with Minister of Finance, Minister Freeland. She was all over this and very committed to seeing that we could create an environment that would attract Canadian capital to be spent, in particular in response to the IRA spending in the United States that skewed the whole North American playing field. There are clearly people in the cabinet who get it. Is there as big a business community in the cabinet today as there was in Paul Martin's day or Jean Chrétien's day? We could have another debate about that. And I've not done the analysis, but it seems to me we could use more voices who understand the business climate and are prepared to say so.
Yeah, we got to get them to run, though, right?
Got to get them to run.
Got to get them to run.
And listen, David, it's time for you to get off that microphone and get yourself in front of in Parliament.
Yeah, there's absolutely no demand for that and never has been. There has been no draft. I've been waiting for 61 years for a draft. It has never come. So I've given up that illusion. But let's talk about politics for a second before we wrap up. The Trudeau government's desperate for economic ideas right now. Do you have something for them? What do you think they should be doing?
I would never prescribe to give them advice in this environment. As I began the show by telling you, I've decided to not be a talking head. I've done more talking. You've managed to pull that out of me than I intended to do, especially about the political environment. Let me just say they know where I and many others would want to be helpful to the government of the day. And look, Canada, whatever the political environment in Canada, whatever party is in the ascendancy, whatever party is struggling to try and make a comeback, it is never in Canada's interest for the country to fail. It's part of the political process. So with all the challenges we have, we need to remind ourselves. I remind myself all the time. I've been around since the 70s paying attention to the political process. I'm a pretty old guy. We can think of lots of problems. Problems we know. We hear about them every day. This is still a phenomenal country. It still has the lowest unemployment we've seen in your lifetime and mine. And low unemployment right across Canada. Atlantic Canada used to be the place where unemployment was in the teens. It isn't anymore. We have a huge demand for a workforce that if we didn't have the sizable immigration that we have, we wouldn't be able to maintain. I was sitting with a driver of a car who was taking me to the airport in Montreal a week or so ago. I said, "How are things in Montreal?" He said, "Great, but the restaurants are closing." I said, "Well, why are the restaurants closing?" He said, "Because they can't find the workers to staff those restaurants. It's not because the clientele are not there. The workforce isn't there." Look, we are in a phenomenal time of global expansion and growth. Big challenges, big changes. Looks like the current economic challenge we're going through looks to be more of a soft landing than a hard landing. So we'll get on the other side of this thing, and in due course, as inflation comes under control, rates will begin to come down. The economy is cyclical. We've gone through a bump or two or three in the road, but we'll get on the other side of it. And this is still an extraordinarily blessed country. It is. Do we have housing problems? Yes. Do we have problems with that are a direct result of climate change? Huge. Do we have an aging population in certain regions in particular? 100%. Have we solved the problem of reconciliation? Absolutely not. We have miles and miles yet to go. But on balance, a phenomenal country. And the world is in relatively good shape. I know I sound like I'm being Pollyannish right now, but I worry that we get so bombarded with the size of our problems, we forget the size of our potential, and we forget to celebrate those things that are worth celebrating in Canada today.
Yeah. But I'm always a glass half empty kind of guy. So haven't you noticed over the course of the time that you started in politics to now, over that period of time, that the nature of jobs has changed? Like you talked about the unemployment rate. And, growing up in the 70s and 80s, I had the impression, and maybe I was wrong, I had the impression that if you had a full-time job in Canada, you were going to be able to find some housing for yourself, and you were going to be able to feed yourself. And now we have people who have full-time jobs who can't afford to rent anything. And food bank directors tell me that they've got thousands and thousands of people with full-time jobs showing up at their food banks. So I'm not sure what a low unemployment rate means anymore.
You're talking about the quality of the jobs that we have and the quality of work. And I agree that that's a fair observation on your part. That is the challenge. That is the challenge. And that is why I say to you, we need to be very careful when we're sloganeering in public life, for that matter in private life, not to chase away or discourage the kind of innovative entrepreneurs. And I in particular think about young entrepreneurs, people who are mobile, people who today think about living, working anywhere. The world is more mobile than it's ever been. And no more so amongst the population, call it 35 and under. That's where all the emerging talent is, and the new industry is. And I worry that generation of entrepreneurs are pulling up stakes if they don't feel that what they're trying to accomplish isn't appreciated here. And those are the jobs that you just talked about that are the value jobs. Those are the good incomes. Those are the opportunity for people to have a good quality of life. But look, the blunt reality is, if you have the kind of population growth that we have, the kind of movement into the centers, be it Vancouver or Calgary or Halifax or St. John's or Toronto or wherever, right across the country, that we've experienced in Canada, and immigration on top of that, and you don't have a housing policy that's prepared to address that growth, then scarcity creates high values, and high values mean that people who are starting out in life, as you just said, not only can't afford to buy a house, they can't even afford often to rent something that's acceptable, that allows them to begin their own lives as young adults. So we have, without getting into the blame game, we collectively, private sector, municipalities, cities, provincial governments, federal, we've failed to anticipate our needs in terms of housing in the urban centers, in particular of Canada. It's an urban phenomenon that you've just described.
Yeah, that's right. It is. Yes. All right. I've only got a few minutes left with you, so I'm just going to try this one more time.
I know you're gonna try and break one more inappropriate political comment out of me after all these years of being disciplined and behaving myself.
I am.
Have at it. So you got a crowbar in your hand, so you can break it open.
I've got it. Trudeau government suddenly finds itself in trouble in the polls. Other than 8 years in power, what do you think their problem is?
Other than 8 years, well, I think their first problem is 8 years of power.
Of course, obviously, almost any government's going to struggle for re-election, no doubt about it.
And every government, the Mulroney government after 8 years, the Harper government, the Chrétien government. Once you've done several terms, it's difficult, and it applies equally to every political party, provincial, federal, doesn't matter. The days of Joey Smallwood or W.A.C. Bennett or being in office for 20 years, those days are over, and they should be. They should be over. What do I think the challenge is? I mean, if I were to offer up a prescription, which I clearly shouldn't, it seems to me, I still think there is a big, broad, centrist political movement in Canada that is looking to find tables around which people who come from the right and or the left can actually find common ground. In other words, they're not interested in being part of that troop or that troop. They're interested in sitting at a table trying to say, well, how can we work together, and where is it we can find common? We won't agree on everything, but what is it we can agree upon, and let's try and make some progress together. And I find that table's missing in the Canadian political climate. I don't think there is a center table. I think we're being invited off to one wing of the island or the other. Whenever you have that, it's the old saying: center doesn't hold. There is no center. So I think
but isn't that the purpose of the Liberal Party, right?
If I were offering advice, my advice is remember, look. Traditionally, the Liberal Party has represented fishermen, farmers, woodworkers, forestry people, miners, blue-collar workers, the guys that are jumping on airplanes and flying halfway across the country for 2 weeks of work and going back home for 2 weeks and doing it again 2 weeks later.
We don't know those people anymore, Brian. We don't know those people anymore. The Liberal Party doesn't know those people anymore.
Remember what happened in the United States, right? We wondered, how did Hillary Clinton lose the election? She lost the election because Donald Trump got the votes in bedrock democratic states of blue-collar workers. Big shock to everybody. Union workers. Why did they vote for Donald Trump? Because they thought that they could relate to Donald Trump or that Donald Trump could relate to them? No. They voted for Donald Trump because they felt the party they traditionally identified with perhaps had forgotten.
Was judging them, rejects them.
Judging them. Yeah. So in Canada, we should not assume that we can't learn some lessons from that that's not an object lesson for us to think about. And if I had to guess what the Liberal caucus has been talking about in over the last few days, I would guess that in one form or another, that's been part of the debate and part of the dialogue. And so let's see what happens. And then, the measure of leadership is not that not that you get a message. The measure of leadership is what you do with it. And so we'll see what happens.
Cool. Hey, can I end by just asking you to really reminisce for my listeners to somebody that probably nobody younger than me knows who they are, but your first job in politics was working for Don Jamieson.
Yeah.
Am I correct about that?
Correct. Yeah.
Don Jamieson was a legend of his time, major figure in Mr. Trudeau Sr.'s governments. And both you and David McNaughton worked for him. Must have been quite a good staff, right?
It was great fun.
What can you?
Is there
a story or a remembrance or something about Don Jamieson you want to tell us?
The problem is, there are stories I can't tell you. I first of all, the very first job I ever had was with Bill Rowe, who was the leader of the Liberal Party back in the '77. He hired me to be an executive assistant, and Don Jamieson succeeded Rowe, and I became Don's EA. So I wasn't working in Ottawa at the time. I was working in.
Oh, that's right, because he left Ottawa to try to be the premier. That's right. Yeah.
He ran against Brian Beckford. He was not successful, and I was there for his transition from, the foreign minister of Canada to leader of the opposition in Newfoundland. Not an easy transition. The one little comment I'd make about Don, and there were many one could make, he was such a great human being, but I was working for him for a couple of months, and on the schedule, for mysterious reasons, every Wednesday morning between 8:30 and 10:30, the schedule was blocked, and Mr. J, as we called him, was in his office. So after, 5 or 6 weeks, I went in there at the end of the blocked period, knocked on the door. I was 22, 23 years old. And I said, Mr. J, there's something I've been dying to ask you for the last month and a half. He said, what's that? He had that broadcast voice. Yeah. I said, what are you doing Wednesday mornings for 2 hours? I really need your time. I got a lot of constituents who want to talk to you, a lot of people who want to meet you. I really need this time. He said, well, you can't have it. I said, well, what are you doing? He said, you want to know what I'm doing, young man? I said, yeah, I do. What are you doing? He said, I think. I said, you think? He said, I think. He said, I will tell you something. Life is like a big river. A big noisy river. And you're either going to be carried along by it, or you have to figure out how to direct it. He said, I spend 2 hours a week trying to figure out how to direct my life. He said, and not enough people spend enough time doing that. I thought it was a great lesson. Never forgot it.
That is a good piece of advice and a very good excuse for napping.
There you go. Yeah. It worked well for him.
Yeah. Listen, Brian, I thank you so much for giving us an hour out of your busy time. It was great talking with you again. Really great talking with you again.
And great talking with you, and to all of those who want to avail of the very best banking service in Canada, BMO's waiting.
There you go. Excellent. All right. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail. Everybody who watched or listened, thank you. And a special thanks, of course, to the Honourable Brian Tobin for being with us today. Take care of yourself. I hope we have a beer soon, man. That was fun.
Pleasure. Cheers. Yeah. Take care. Bye.